Hello, everybody. Welcome to our quarterly NAI webinar on demystifying gender equity and athletic compliance. This is brought to you by the Leadership and Diversity and Inclusion Committee from the NAIA. And so we want to go ahead and allow you to know your rights and college responsibility as it relates to gender equity and athletic compliance, as well as demystifying exactly what this means and how it applies to your athletic department. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So as we look at what the law says, Title IX requires that schools treat both sexes equally with regard to three distinct aspects of athletics. So the first one is going to be participation and opportunities. We want to make sure that we're treating both sexes equally in this aspect. And the next one is the athletic scholarships. And then after that, we move on to the treatment of male and female team. So we want to make sure that our participation opportunities are equal. We want to make sure that our athletic scholarships are reflecting that equality as well. And then we want to make sure that we're treating our male and female teams equally. But the most significant and urgent issue that's facing intercollegiate athletic programs in Title IX is the fact that we have to make sure that we are complying with the OCR directive, that if we are not treating our programs equally, then it can lead to termination of financial assistance of the university and the entire institution. It can cause the university to have to pay compensatory and punitive damages. And so one of the things that I want you to understand about Title IX and equity is Title IX is not just an athletic department concern, but it is an institution-wide responsibility. And so this is one of the most significant issues facing our athletic programs today. And so one of the things that you need to understand about Title IX is that it's a federal civil rights statute that was enacted as part of the Education Amendments of 1972. And so in simple terms, this just prohibits sex-based discriminations to any institution that's receiving federal financial assistance. And so that applies to just about everyone who will be listening to this particular webinar today. So people ask a lot of times, what does Title IX cover? And so this is one of the things that we want to uncover. Every aspect of federally funded programs is what Title IX is covering. So you look, access to higher education, Title IX is covering that. Athletics, Title IX is covering that. Career education, Title IX is covering that. When it comes to education for pregnant and parenting students, Title IX is covering that. When it talks about employment and working, Title IX is covering that. Also, it covers the learning environment, math and science, sexual harassment, standardized testing, and technology. So we don't want to try to box Title IX into just athletics or just sexual harassment. It is much bigger than that, and it affects a lot of areas, and that's why I tell you that this is an institution-wide responsibility. So let's look at what it requires. So what does Title IX require as we look at our athletic departments? So one of the things that I want you to understand is that it does not require that equal dollars be spent on men and women. Only that female and male student athletes must receive equitable benefits. So you want to make sure, even though you're not spending the same money on all the programs, you got to make sure that both male and female, are receiving equitable benefits. Next, Title IX does not require the same amount of money to be spent on men and women's sports. And so this does allow for discrepancies in costs as they are based on legitimate and justifiable non-gender related costs. And so we want to make sure that, but it does not require you to spend an equal amount on men and women's sports. It doesn't require identical programs for men's and women's sports. Also, no sport is excluded from Title IX. A lot of people say, well, football should be excluded from Title IX, or basketball should be excluded from Title IX, or tennis should be excluded. No sport is ever excluded from Title IX. One of the other things that you want to understand is that the tiering of sports programs allows institutions to choose to provide greater resources for some teams as long as it provides those resources proportionately to females. And so the last thing that you need to understand is that no matter what form the money comes in, so if it's fundraising, if it's donations, if it's ticket revenue, once it's expended or provided to the teams, it must be counted by the institution in evaluating Title IX compliance. So we can't hide the money or say, hey, this money was over here in this fund. We've got to make sure that we evaluate it in light of Title IX compliance, no matter what form that the money comes in. So let's look at some myths with regard to Title IX and athletics. One of the first myths is Title IX requires quotas. The fact is that Title IX does not require a quota. It simply requires that schools allocate participation opportunities in a non-discriminatory way. So there is no quota. Title IX requires that all schools receiving federal funds provide female students with equal opportunities to participate in educational programs, including athletics. So there are no quotas as it relates to Title IX. Because Title IX allows sports teams to be separated by sex, schools get to decide how many participation opportunities they will give to female students. So a school can meet this requirement of providing equal opportunities to play if it can demonstrate any of the following. So we've got 3 prongs. You don't have to do all 3 of them. You just have to do one. So I want to get that out again. You don't have to do all 3, but you must meet one of these 3 prongs. So the first prong is that the percentages of male and female athletes are substantially proportionate to the percentage of male and female students enrolled. And so we're going to look at a case when we get ready to close this webinar at Eastern Michigan, where we're going to look at all 3 of these prongs and see how the outcome came about in their lawsuit, because they were challenged on Title IX and equity in athletics. And so we're going to see how that ended, and we're going to look at these prongs. So the first one, again, is the percentages of male and female student athletes are substantially proportionate to the percentages of male and female students enrolled. The second one is that the school has a history and a continuing practice of expanding athletic opportunities for the underrepresented sex. And then lastly, that its athletic programs are fully and effectively accommodating the interests and abilities of the underrepresented sex. So you got these 3 prongs. You have to be able to show that you're meeting one. The next myth, the Education Department has pushed Title IX beyond the language of the statute. Now, people are saying that Title IX is overreaching or that it's overbroad. And so the fact is that the federal courts have upheld this 3-part test as consistent with Title IX's languages and goals. And so we have to understand that it has not gone beyond the scope. All 9 federal courts of appeals have addressed the issues, and they've deferred to consistently and applied the 3-part test, and none have held that the test imposes quotas, and none have held that Title IX is going beyond the language of the statute. One of the next ones is that women aren't just interested in sports. Women just aren't interested in sports. That's the fact is that Title IX is a real example of the field of dreams. If you build it, they will come. The fact here is that after Title IX, women's participation in intercollegiate sports has skyrocketed. And so the proof here is that interest often reflects the opportunity. Of course, if there's no opportunity, then there's not going to be any interest. But when you provide more and more opportunity, then there's going to be more and more interest. Is why we've seen and continue to see women's participation in college sports continue to skyrocket. One of the next myths is that Title IX forces schools to cut men's sports. This is simply not true. Title IX does not require or encourage the cutting of any sports. What it does allow schools to make choices about how they structure their programs as long as they don't discriminate. Next, Title IX requires equal spending on men's and women's sports. Again, we talked about this a little earlier. Title IX does not require schools to spend the same amount of money on male and female student athletes. Title IX does require schools to treat male and female athletes equally, but it recognizes that a football uniform costs more than a swimsuit. So it does not require that a school spend the same amount of money on uniforms for the swim team as the football team. However, the school cannot provide the men with top-notch uniforms and the women with low-quality uniforms, or give the men home and away and practice uniforms and provide the female student athletes with only one set of uniforms. So there has to be some equality there, but it does not require equal spending on men and women's sports. Next, we want to look at the accommodation and athletic interests and abilities, which is the participation opportunities. We want to look at athletic scholarships, and then we want to look at this idea of the benefits, treatment, and services. And there's 11 core areas there as it relates to Title IX equity. So this whole concept of Title IX equity evolves around these 3 areas. So the accommodation of the athletic interests and abilities, which is basically the participation opportunities, the athletic scholarships, and then the benefits, treatment, and services, which is those 11 core areas that we're going to look at. So OCR, which is the Office of Civil Rights, defines the following as a participant. So everyone who on the first day of competition who's received institutionally sponsored support normally provided to athletes competing at the institution, and anyone participating in organized practice sessions and team meetings or activities on a regular basis during the sports season, and if they're listed on the eligibility squad list for each sport, and then we have an or here, who because of injury cannot meet the above but continue to receive financial aid on the basis of athletic eligibility. So you have these kind of 4 areas on how OCR defines a participant. As we look at athletic scholarships, athletic financial aid, as opposed to what's spent, as opposed to what's budgeted, should be within 1% of the student-athlete participation percentages. Not the undergraduate enrollment, but the student-athlete participation percentages. So this is very important. So if the student-athlete participation is 45% male and 55% female, then the scholarship dollars must be spent within 1% of that ratio, of that 55-45%. And so there cannot be a big disparity in that ratio. So make sure that whatever your student-athlete participation rate is, make sure that the scholarship dollars are in 1% of that. Next, we look at the benefits, treatments, and supplies. This is a big, big area. And so we've got 11 things that we're going to look at. The first one, and we're going to look at them one by one. So the first one is equipment and supplies. The next one is the scheduling of games and practice times. And then we have third, which is travel and per diem allowances. Fourth, we look at the opportunity to receive coaching assignments and coaching compensation. Then we have the opportunity to receive academic tutoring. So we look at the assignment of the tutors, the compensation of the tutors. We look at the locker rooms and the practice and competitive facilities, the medical and training facilities and services, which includes the weight room, the housing and dining facilities and services, publicity, support services, and then the recruitment of student athletes. So we've got to take a hard look at all of these 11 areas. So as we look at the equipment and supplies, we want to look at the quality of our equipment and supplies. We want to look at the suitability of our equipment and supplies. And then we also want to look at the amount of it. How much do we have? We want to look at the maintenance and replace it. How much are we maintaining this stuff? How often are we replacing these things? Are we replacing the men's stuff before the women's stuff? Are we doing more for the women or for the men? And then how much of it is available at what time? And so we've got to look at all of that with equipment and supplies to make sure that we have equity. Next, we look at the scheduling of games and practice times. And so the numbers of competitive events per sports. So how many competitive events are we having in each sport? How long are the practice times? And how much practice are we allowing, the number of practices for each team? How are we doing that? What facilities are we providing for them to practice? What time of day are we allowing the female student athletes? Are they participating during their academic day, whereas the men are playing all their games at night or on the weekend? So how are we scheduling these games? What time of day are the practice opportunities being scheduled as well? And where are they being scheduled? And then also, what opportunities to engage in available preseason and postseason competition? So are we allowing our student athletes to participate in a preseason or participate in a postseason? So we have to look at all of that as well and make sure that we have equity in those areas. Next, we've got to look at travel and per diem allowances. So how are we traveling? You know, do we have one team that's riding on a bus and another team that's flying to all of their games? What is the mode of transportation? You know, is housing furnished during travel, or do we have teams that are simply going to the game and traveling back on the same day? What is the length of stay before and after competitive events? And the next one is, what are the per diem allowances? Do we have one group that's just eating fast food for every game because maybe their per diem is, $25 a day, where another team is $45 a day or something like that? We got to make sure that our per diem allowances are equitable, and also make sure that our dining arrangements are equitable as well. The next thing that we want to look at is academic tutoring. So we want to know the opportunity to receive academic tutoring and the availability of tutors, and what is the procedure and the criteria for obtaining tutorial assistance. Also, what is the assignment of the tutors? What is the qualification of the tutors? What training and experience and other qualifications do they have? And are we doing that equitable amongst the men and women? Also, the compensation of tutors, which is the rate of pay. And we don't see these issues a lot in the NAIA, but in the NCAA, the University of Missouri was just sanctioned for having people doing the student athletes' work. So they had tutors that were paid, but the tutors were doing the work of the student athletes, and so there was a big sanction that they had. And so that's something that we also want to be aware of too, is to make sure that the tutors are just tutoring and not actually doing the work. Title IX equity for locker rooms, practice facilities, and competitive facilities. So the quality and availability of facilities provided for practice and competitive events. As you can see, we don't want to have a really nice locker room for one sport, and then we have these trash locker rooms for another sport, or these old, outdated locker rooms for the females, but we have these nice, updated recruiting type locker rooms for the male student athletes. And the next thing we want to look at is the exclusivity of use of facilities and practice for competitive events, and the availability of locker rooms. Again, the quality of locker rooms, the maintenance and practice of the competitive facilities, and then also the preparation of the facilities for practice and competitive events. And so this is where we got to look at our courts, courses, and fields to make sure that all of that is equitable for all of our student athletes. The next one is the medical training services and facilities. So we got to look at, do we have medical personnel that's available to assist? What about insurance? Are we covering our male student athletes the same way that we're covering our female student athletes with regard to health, accident, and injury insurance? What about the weight training and facilities? So we got to make sure that not only they're available, but we want to make sure that they're quality. We want to make sure that our facilities are also available and they're of sound quality, all the facilities that we use. And we also want to make sure that our athletic trainers and athletic staff are fully qualified and available to serve our student athletes. We want to make sure that we're equitable there. These are all of the areas that the Department of Education and the Office of Civil Rights would look at if there was an issue of your institution. Next, we look at housing and dining facilities and services. So one is housing provided, and then what kind of special services are a part of housing, and laundry and facilities and parking spaces and maid services. We want to make sure that how are we feeding our student athletes? Do they have their own common area where they eat? And do we have something that looks like this particular picture here? And, you know, maybe somebody else is just eating in a regular cafeteria with limited meal options. So we want to make sure that we're equitable there as well. The next area is publicity. So what are you doing in the media in your athletic department for your male and female student athletes? What kind of availability and quality of sports information and media relations personnel? Are you covering your female sports programs as well as you're covering the men's sports programs? What kind of publications do you have? What kind of web pages do you have? What kind of social media outlets and other promotional devices do you have that feature both your men's and women's program? Also, what kind of things do you have for access as far as radio or TV or streaming? What do you have for your student athletes and for your programs to show that this is equitable? Are you streaming both the men's and women's sports? Do you have radio programs for both the men's and women's sports? Things like that. You want to make sure that you're looking at that as it relates to your specific programs. The next area is support services. So we've got to look at the amount of administrative assistance that's provided to the men's and women's programs. What kind of secretarial or clerical assistance do you have that's provided to the men's and women's programs? What kind of non-coaching personnel is provided to the men's and women's programs? Do you have a director of operations or video technicians or personnel assistants? Also, what kind of office space and equipment and supplies do you have that are dedicated to your student athletes? And so as you look at this image, you see the academic support services, and then you have the things going down to the student athletes, and you have everything going up. So you have faculty that are available to them. You have instructors and academic advisors and student services and athletic administration and university administration that are providing academic support services to your student athletes, and it must be equitable amongst your males and females. Lastly, we have the recruitment of student athletes. And so whether it's coaches or professional personnel that are provided with substantial opportunities to recruit. So do your coaches that are recruiting female student athletes, do they have the same options, they have the same opportunities that the people that are recruiting your male student athletes have? Also, when we look at the financial and other resources that are available for recruitment, so are the financial resources available to recruit people for the men's programs and the women's programs? Are those equal? The differences in the benefits of opportunities and treatment afforded to prospective student athletes of each sex have disproportionately limiting effect upon the recruitment of students of either sex. So we can't have anything that's disproportionately limiting whether you can recruit men or women to your school to play sports. And so this comes in initial letters and recruiting questionnaires, preliminary evaluations, the visits, the calls, the in-person evaluations, the extended verbal offers, and signing athletes. So this process must be equitable for your male and female programs, and there can't be anything that limits the effect of recruiting, whether that be opportunities or whether that be money. You got to make sure that that's equitable. So as we get ready to bring this to a close, one of the things that I want to talk about is the Eastern Michigan lawsuit. And so what I want to tell you about this is how this applies to the three prongs. So I want you to see how this works. This is a great case to see how gender equity in athletics works, and also for those of you who may be getting ready to cut budgets or you may be getting ready to cut sports, this is a particular case that you really want to look at and pay attention to so that you don't fall into the trap or the misunderstanding that Eastern Michigan did. I feel like this is a great case for all of us to look at, for all of us to understand, and for all of us to apply to our own programs. And so I share this with you just to press upon you the importance of gender equity in Title IX athletics and how the law applies to the facts. So in this case, a federal district court in Michigan issued an injunction against Eastern Michigan University that prevented it from going forward with its plans to cut women's softball and tennis teams. So what happened is the university announced in 2018 that they were going to cut those teams along with 2 men's teams, wrestling, swimming, and diving. So right now everything looks good. Hey, we're going to cut women's sports, we're going to cut women's softball, we're going to cut women's tennis, but we're also going to cut men's wrestling and men's swimming and diving. So everything looks good on its face because we're cutting 2 sports, 2 for the men, 2 for the women. Everything looks good. However, as the court correctly determined, cutting the same number of men's and women's sports is not gender equity when the men have disproportionately more athletic opportunities to begin with and continue to have a greater share of opportunities once those cuts have taken place. So even though they were cutting the same amount of sports for the men and women, since the men have always had more opportunity and they would continue to have more opportunity, the court rejected this. So the undergraduate population at Eastern Michigan University is about 60% female, yet the distribution of athletic opportunities favors men 56% to 44%. We got to make sure that we're complying here. So Eastern Michigan did not try to claim compliance under the proportionality prong because they knew they were off. So that was the first prong. Nor did they argue that it complied under the third prong, which calls for the absence of unmet interest and abilities amongst members of the underrepresented sex. So a decision that the court validated by pointing out Eastern Michigan University's elimination of women's programs creates the very unmet interest of the third compliance prong requirements to be satisfied. So they did meet the first prong and they did meet the third prong of making interest and availability for the underrepresented sex. So instead, Eastern Michigan University argued that the average number of athletic opportunities over the last 5 years was greater than the average number over the 5 years before that. So they felt like they satisfied the second compliance prong, which calls for the history and continuing practice of program expansion for the underrepresented sex. So to be clear, they knew they didn't have the first prong, they knew they didn't have the third prong, but they felt like they could stick with the second prong because, again, I told you before that you only have to show that you meet one of those 3 prongs. So they went with the second prong. However, the court rejected this arbitrary comparison of average data, which only served to mask the fluctuation of the up and down number of female athletic opportunities. The compliance prong calls for steady growth, which Eastern Michigan numbers simply did not show. In addition, Eastern Michigan's most recent edition of women's sports teams was rowing in the year 2000, and so they were not able to show in 2018 that they've had a continuing evidence and the continuing practice of providing these participation opportunities for women in athletics. So, though Eastern Michigan University tried to claim credit for the increase in female athletic opportunities under its roster management plan, so they said that we've expanded the rosters of our existing women's teams, we've added more slots. The court rejected this as well because Eastern Michigan could not show that the increases were responsive to the developing interests of the underrepresented sex as this prong requires. So, upon concluding that Eastern Michigan, or that the plaintiffs here in the case, which were 2 female student athletes, one of them was going to be unjustly harmed by this because she was going to have to get she was going to have to go home. She was going to have to get another visa and come back and try to play, sports at another school. One of the other student athletes was at Eastern Michigan to play sports, but also was studying aviation. And so she argued that not only am I going to lose my scholarship and I'm going to have to find another school to play at, I specifically came to Eastern Michigan so that I could study aviation and play sports, and I'm not going to be able to do this if I go somewhere else. And so the court concluded that they had demonstrated the likely success on the merits as well as other factors when deciding on a preliminary injunction that the court ordered that the university had to reinstate the eliminated teams. And the court, through a thorough analysis, however, it is helpful to understand all of the misconceptions about this second compliance prong. The court ordered to reinstate the eliminated teams to provide a cautionary tale for any college athletic program that thinks that cutting an equal number of men and women's sports is equitable when the women are already seriously underrepresented. And so I think that that is something that we all need to take note of, because it would be really easy as athletic directors to say, hey, we're going to cut our budget, because they wanted to cut their budget by $2.4 million. They felt like if we cut these two men's sports, these two women's sports, we get that. We've saved the money. We've met the athletic budget and what we need to do. But as far as the equity component, they failed there. And so you can't cut unless there's equity amongst men and women. So you want to make sure that you have that and perform a thorough analysis before you do it, because the Office of Civil Rights can come in or your student athletes could file a lawsuit against you, and it's just not worth it. So we want to make sure that we're doing this the right way and that we're having equity amongst our men and women's athletic teams. So one of the things that you need to understand about Title IX equity is there are more lawsuits to come. Title IX lawsuits generally have become much more common in our current climate. Government investments in higher education are going down. Colleges and universities are steadily shrinking their budgets, and athletic programs are eliminating teams and taking away teams at times. They're moving wrestling. They're taking tennis away, some taking golf away. So different schools are doing different things to save money, and they're not having a bunch of sports across the board. So when these cuts come, especially to smaller schools such as our NAIA schools who have sometimes struggled financially, equity issues will continue to arise just like they did when we saw the expansion in college sports. So just like we saw in the 70s, we saw the expansion of college sports. We saw women participating at a higher level. We wanted to make sure that we had equity. Now we're about to see the same thing as we get ready to cut sports because of budgets. We're going to see the same thing in the same types of lawsuits. So we have to make sure that we have Title IX equity in our athletic programs. It is paramount. So you want to make sure that you get with your Title IX coordinator or your Title IX administrator and make sure that you do an equity analysis for your university every year, because you do not want the Department of Education or OCR, the Office of Civil Rights, coming in and doing an audit on your program, because Eastern Michigan has a lot more resources than a lot of us have, and they failed miserably on this case. And so this is a red flag, I believe, for all of us, and is a current event that we all need to look at and pay attention to as we handle our business in our various athletic departments. So, goals of Title IX. We want to make sure that we provide men and women student athletes with participation opportunities in substantial proportion to their representation in the student body. We want to make sure that the financial assistance is a substantial proportion to the representation of women student athletes in the athletic program. And lastly, we want to make sure that we provide equivalent benefits, opportunity, and treatment throughout the athletic program for both men's and women's sports. These are three things that we need to be doing across the board for our respective programs. At this time, we want to thank you for joining us for our quarterly webinar brought to you by the Leadership, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee with the NAIA. My name is Dr. Justin Lawrence. I'm the Title IX Administrator at Wayland Baptist University. If you have any questions about this presentation, you can call me at 806-291-1173, or you can email me at lawrencej@wbu.edu. I hope that this presentation was beneficial for you. Again, if you have any questions, please let us know. We also want to thank Laura Simcox for putting this together, these informative webinar series, so that we can learn more about how to comply with Title IX and gender equity. Thank you.